Eckert introduce our speaker. Oh.
Yes, thank you very much, Dan. And I think very appropriately, I decided, because I really didn't know that much about Jason Snell, everybody knows his name, I decided to use artificial intelligence to see, use ChatGPT, what that app would come up with. And here's their response. And Jason, please tell me whether you accept it or whether it contains serious mistakes. Here it is. This is what they recommend that I should say. It is with great pleasure that I have the distinct honor of welcoming our esteemed speaker for today, Mr. Jason Snell. He is an accomplished writer, editor, podcaster, and technology enthusiast with a wealth of experience in the field. As a former editor at MacWorld, he has been at the forefront of the technology industry for decades, providing insightful analysis, thought leadership, and engaging storytelling. Jason's passion for technology and media has led him to create and host numerous successful podcasts, such as The Incomparable. His expertise and knowledge have garnered him a dedicated following, and his unique perspective on the ever-evolving world of technology has made him an influential voice within the industry. I want to give a warm welcome to Jason Snell as we eagerly anticipate his insights and reflections on today's most pressing topics. Welcome, Jason.
Wow. Thank you, and thank you to the robots. That was a very ChatGPT introduction. It had a lot of facts that were not wrong and a lot of superlatives that were very nice, and I'm not entirely sure I entirely agree with them, but I appreciate it, and thank you everybody else. Yeah, my short personal bio would basically be that I started writing about Apple 30 years ago. Oh my goodness. Back when it was the bad time. I always tell people that I started covering Apple when it was doomed. It was a bad career move. I had a lot of questions about it, and then things changed pretty rapidly in the late 90s. And I was the lead editor. I worked at MacWorld for a long time, and I was the editor-in-chief at MacWorld for more than a decade. And then in about coming up, it's not quite 10 years, 9 years ago coming up, I went out on my own and started my own podcast and my own website, sixcolors.com. And that is what I do now. So I do what I started in this business to do, which is actually cover these topics. As my career advanced at MacWorld and its parent company, I spent less time doing that, but that was always my favorite part. So I'm very happy to do that as my job now, and it's a great job to be able to play with technology and engage with all of what Apple is doing. And I do it from my garage, which is where I am now. This is my garage. I have set up old computers back here in order to give myself a little bit of a video backdrop, but this is my washing machine is over there. So it's still also my garage, and my dog is sleeping over here. Also, good morning. 8:30 here in California. I know that Sheeta at one point asked me to teach a class that was going to be at 7 in the morning. I was on a Saturday, and I was like, I don't know. I'm starting to do more podcasts at 9 in the morning and 8:30 in the morning, but still it's a little bit early. So thank you for being here. And I have had 2 cups of tea, so we're ready to go. This presentation is going to be kind of broad. I decided to do a presentation. A lot of my user group presentations are sort of like, where are we now and what is coming up with Apple that we know of? Apple obviously keeps everything a secret. They like to do that, but there are leaks and rumors and speculation. And I feel like if there's anything that I've trained to do over the last 20 years, it's filter through the information about what Apple is going to do and try to understand, based on their history and where they are currently in the market and what's likely in terms of the technology and what the reports are from people who have good sources, what is likely to be coming down the road. But no guarantees. I'm going to talk about that in broad strokes. I found generally when I talk to user groups, there are if I get too far down in the weeds, people are like, "Whoa, you're gonna have to define your terms." So I'm gonna keep it at a fairly high level, but Each of these sections, I think it's pretty clear um, that there are places in there for your questions if you want more detail about any of this. So as we go, and then at the end, I like I said when we got started, I would love your questions. If you have detailed questions or predictions or anything about Apple, I'm happy to oblige that. So also, I stopped doing when I started doing Zoom presentations, I stopped doing keynotes, although I am envious. There are some really great video tools out there that let you do things like having a person talk like what Dan had, where he's in the corner and he's got slides, and that's one of these days I'm going to try that. But I decided it was really actually quite pleasant to work from an outline and not have to worry about a slide deck. So I have no slide deck. It's just me and my outline. So let's get started. Where are we right now? I want to do a set up of like where we are right now, what's happened lately. On the Mac, we are at the end of the M2 generation. So Apple Silicon came in and really was a shot in the arm for the Mac. Mac sales have been at record levels. I think that in the last 2 years, we've seen the 4 or 5, 6 quarters of the most Mac sales ever in its history, which is not bad for a platform that's coming up on 40 years old. And Apple Silicon, some people say some Mac sales were probably brought forward because of the pandemic, where people are like, oh boy, I'm going to be working at home. Maybe we should buy a new Mac. But also, I think the arrival of Apple Silicon and the increased battery life and performance, and it really drove a lot of sales. The Mac is doing pretty great. The M2 generation is the follow-on. It is based on the next iPhone chip. And it is, so we saw that starting less than a year ago now, and it's made its way to the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro, the Mac Mini, not the iMac, which is kind of interesting. And they're not the Mac Studio, and there's still no Mac Pro. So there's some stuff still floating out there, but it feels very much like the M2 cycle is ending and new something is going to begin. I feel like Apple is really starting to find their rhythm in terms of this chip architecture. It certainly seems to me, okay, so laptops. I know that there are, I'm sitting here talking on a Mac Studio with a Studio Display. So I am a desktop Mac user, but I also have a laptop. The truth is that over the course of about 10 years, Mac sales went from 50% laptops to 75% laptops. Apple doesn't detail that breakdown anymore, so we don't actually know, but I would be shocked if it wasn't like 80-20 at least of laptops to desktops in terms of Mac sales. So laptops are the most important Mac, and the MacBook Air is the best-selling Mac laptop. So and it's the best-selling Mac. So the MacBook Air is really the definitive Mac at this point, if you think of it that way in those terms. And when you look at the rhythm of sort of Apple's Mac updates, you can see them prioritizing laptops. So the MacBook Air was in the M1 and the M2. The MacBook Pro has been updated for M1 and M2 with the higher end options on the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros. So every year, I think Apple is going to refresh. Every time there's a new processor, there will be a new update to the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro. I think that's just going to be how it is. What's interesting is that hasn't happened on the desktop side. There is no M2 iMac. There is no M2 Mac Studio. There is an M2 Mac Mini, but what they did there was sort of add in the higher end chip option that they weren't able to do with the M1 Mini. So if I had to guess, my guess is that Apple's probably going to be updating. It's still a mystery. Will there be a new M chip every year, or will it be every 18 months? I think they want it to be in lockstep with the A series chips in the iPhone, and that would mean a new one every year. I'm not sure whether they'll do that or not, but I think that might be their ideal scenario. And in that scenario, I think you would see a new version of the Mac, of all the laptops, and there may be more than there are currently, every year. But I think it feels to me like the desktops are going to be on an every other year cycle. So M1 iMac and then an M3 iMac. Hopefully an M3 Mac Studio at that point too. Maybe the Mac Mini doesn't get updated until M4 at this point. That kind of like the laptops being a priority and the desktops being kind of done in batches, half of them 1 year, half of them the next year, and moving that forward. And you might say to yourself, but Apple is huge and enormous. Why is it not doing everything all the time? And the answer is, if you've noticed any of the news stories about the tech industry and layoffs and things like that, Apple hasn't laid off anybody. They've done some cost cutting. There was a story in Bloomberg this week about how they have done a bunch of cost cutting, I think, to demonstrate that they're responsible. The truth is, Apple didn't have to lay people off in part because they don't hire people a lot. Apple is Apple has a lot of employees, but a lot of that is being masked by the fact that they've got a lot of retail employees. In terms of, if you take the retail store employees out of it and look at the rest of Apple's employee base, especially the group that is basically in Cupertino and is creating products, and in a few other places working on software and hardware, it's actually a pretty small company. And the group of people who are capable of designing hardware, both from an industrial design standpoint and from an engineering standpoint, it's a very, very small group. And part of that is by design, in terms of, I think Apple feels like they're more functional if they've got a smaller group. And part of it is because of their corporate culture of being really reluctant. It's hard to hire people at Apple. It's hard to get a job at Apple. I have had friends who have been hired there. It's a long process. You might get a call from Apple, and then they say they're interested, and then you don't hear from them for 6 months, and then they say, would you like to talk to somebody? And then that process can go on and on. And as a result, I think Steve Jobs actually tried to create this culture where they're very picky, and they are very careful, and they don't rush to hire. But it does mean that they are smaller in a lot of places than you might expect for a tech giant. And I think you see it at times when it feels like Apple can't walk and chew gum at the same time. They can't, like, what do you mean they can't make a new HomePod? Why can't they? And they're Apple, and the answer is, well, they can't make all those products at once. They can't walk and chew gum at the same time. Sometimes they have to make their choices, and it's a thing that I think helps make Apple good, but also helps it limits Apple in some ways, and that's part of the game. So, continuing on where we are, the iPad, I'd say, is in a lull right now. The latest iPad Pros came out. They had new processor, otherwise basically unchanged, essentially since 2018. The screens have changed, but the overall design has not changed in a long time. There's some rumors that they wanted to do something more, but they just, again, they did not have the bandwidth to do an iPad Pro update. The new iPad base model is apparently doing well, and then the iPad Air, which is actually a really great value in terms of the features and what they charge for that, is in the middle. But the iPad seems to be in a lull. And I've spoken on several podcasts over the last week about my feelings about the iPad, which is a product that I have loved for a long time, and the iPad Pro since it first came out. And yet it feels sort of stalled. And I'm not sure Apple knows quite where it's going next. We'll see. And then where we are on the iPhone is actually the easiest one of all, which is we're halfway, right? The iPhone, like clockwork, which is important because it's, if you don't know, if I make charts every quarter about Apple's financial reports, which I think is a very helpful way for me to visualize the shape of Apple's business. If you don't make or read charts about Apple's business, which I don't blame you for, as a kid, I didn't want to read the business section. I was never interested in it. Now here I am making financial charts. But the iPhone is, let's not forget, like, the Mac business is big, the wearables business is big, the iPad business is big, the services business is big. They're all big, but they're all in the 10%-ish range of Apple's overall revenue for a quarter. More than 50% of Apple's revenue is the iPhone. So the iPhone is the straw that stirs the drink. The iPhone is the drink. The iPhone is Apple's number one priority. It's also really Apple's number 2, 3, and 4 priority. It is that important to the company. And so there's always going to be a new iPhone every year, and or 4 or 5. And that's always going to be their highest priority. So we're halfway through the iPhone cycle. They just did their thing where they released a new color, mostly because I don't know, it works for them. They get to refresh and say, hey, remember the iPhone? Not everybody buys an iPhone in the fall. Sometimes they buy it sort of whenever, and they might be struck by a yellow iPhone and go, oh, that sounds fun. And then they'll buy it. But it's really more of Apple just trying to keep things in, keep the iPhone in the public eye at a time when they are halfway through their cycle of being able to release an iPhone. So that's where we are. Also, the iPhone. I should point out the comment in the chat. Sunshine yellow. It is a nice yellow. I actually have one here. It's a nice yellow. It's bright. It's not quite pastel like Easter. It's also not like super garish like a highlighter pen. What's funny about it is it's just on the regular iPhone, not on the iPhone Pro, because the iPhone Pro, Apple has been reluctant to do bright colors on it. Which the joke that I make is that what would yellow even be like on an? I mean, first off, they have a gold one on the iPhone Pro, but like, what would yellow be? And it would be, it would have to be like, what's a dark yellow? Like my joke was, you call it midnight lemon or something like that. It's just not. I don't think it's that appealing. So, but on the main cheaper iPhone, they added the yellow. Really, again, just because look, I just said the word iPhone a bunch of times. It is, and they get to do a new ad. And I think that's really it, is they just want to re-engage people, and they find some value in doing that when they're late in the cycle, and they are so far ahead of the game in terms of making iPhones to fulfill demand that they can slide in another color choice and it's not going to be a problem. And it is as a technologist, it's baffling that they make a big deal out of something that's literally just another color, but it's not about the technology. It's about fashion. It's about marketing. It's about sort of, marketing really, and PR and re-engaging people about a phone that's 6 months old and is going to be replaced in 6 months. So that is where we are. I am happy to shift gears and talk about what's next. I don't know if this is an opportunity. If there were questions about what I just said, this might be a good break point. I don't know.
We don't really have anything about
Okay,
what you just said. Okay.
All right. I'm telling you what you probably already know, which is how this starts. So, okay, what's next? A lot of stuff out there. I mentioned the Mac Pro. The Mac Pro is still out there. Mac Pro is a funny product because it's a product that's very important psychologically, I think, to Mac users in general, to the Mac and how it's viewed as a platform. The truth is very, very, very few people use a Mac Pro. The Mac Pro is, there was a time, and many of you who are longtime Mac users will probably remember it. There was a time when if you were serious about the Mac, you bought a Power Mac back in the day, right? Like my first Mac was a Mac SE, and then I had a PowerBook 160. But like once I started working at Mac User and then Macworld, like I ended up with essentially Power Macs were my home computers. They were desktops full of packed with power, instead of the sort of like Performa or LC or something like that were the lighter weight systems. Because I was a serious Mac user, and in that era, desktop computers were much more common than laptops, and the Power Mac was a more mainstream product. There was sort of the Power Mac, and there were different levels. People remember the early Power PC days. You have like the 8100 and 7100 and 6100, but they're all Power Macs. That was like a mainstream Mac product. Over the course of the last 20 years, 15 years, the Power Mac and then the Mac Pro, when they moved away from PowerPC, has just vanished in terms of being the definitive Mac. I think the definitive Mac became the iMac, and then it became the MacBook Air. And part of that is the nature of the market changing, where there are more laptops, and then Apple started building consumer desktops based on laptop technology with the iMac. And over time, more and more people were buying those computers. At the same time, Apple was building up the Power Mac G5 and then the Mac Pro as super high-end models. So there was one model, and it was very expensive. And then you could add even more to make it even more expensive, and they were serving very high-end needs. And so as a result, the Mac Pro became this thing that was important in the sense that it showed the potential of the Mac, but not something that most people bought. Very, very limited, very expensive. It was being bought, I think, mostly by institutions, some scientific organization that wanted 50 of them or whatever. And yet it's still out there. Apple recommitted about 5 years ago to the Mac Pro. They came out with the last Intel Mac Pro. They've said that there will be an Apple Silicon Mac Pro. It's the last Intel Mac they sell, is that Intel Mac Pro. It's still on the price list. I don't know. Nobody should buy it, but the only people buying it are people who bought 50 of them, and now they need 2 more, and they just want them all to be the same. So it's a great mystery what they're going to do with the Mac Pro. It's fun to think about it. It's fun. For me, the most fun thing about it is that Apple has moved all of the Mac to Apple Silicon. Apple Silicon is iPhone chips, essentially, iPhone and iPad chips. And they are incredibly impressive at a lot of things. So impressive that Apple was able to take it across their whole product line. This is great. However, some of the reasons they're great, some of the reasons they're impressive are decisions that Apple made that kind of don't make sense if you're trying to build a high-end professional computer like a Mac Pro. So I'm fascinated to see what choices they make, because like Apple Silicon is great because the RAM is on the package. And that means you can't add RAM later. You have to choose how much memory you want on your computer when you buy it with Apple Silicon. But it's so fast, and it's shared between the graphics processors and the CPU. And it allows the Apple Silicon chips and the Macs that run them to be so powerful and also energy efficient. But a Mac Pro doesn't have those priorities. Mac Pros, traditionally, you could add graphics to them, you could add RAM to them, and Apple Silicon has not been about that. So I've spent more time than I probably should on the Mac Pro, but I feel like it's an interesting problem to solve of like, how does Apple approach a computer that doesn't really fit its philosophy with Apple Silicon? And there are still people out there who will point at the Mac Pro's capabilities or lack of same and use it as a proxy for the whole Mac product line. I think those people are probably, wrong. They're saying, well, but you can do this with these, with AMD, Intel, these chips, and at the very high end, and Threadrippers can do this and all of that stuff. I think that sort of misses the point of what Apple's trying to do with the Mac, but it's always going to be there. Of like my friend John Siracusa, who does the Accidental Tech podcast, talks about it as the concept car of the Mac. It's not, the point is to show off Apple's technical prowess, not necessarily that anyone will buy it, or certainly a high-end sports car. Anyway, we will see what happens with that. Really quickly, M3. Obviously, not a big prediction to say that M1 and M2 will be followed by M3. What's interesting about this, and I don't want to get into too much detail about computer chips, but Taiwan Semiconductor, TSMC, is the company that makes Apple's chips for it. So Apple doesn't make their chips. Apple designs their chips, but they don't make them. They have TSMC fabricate them. And TSMC has a new process that's 3 nanometer process. And the idea here is the processes get smaller and smaller and smaller. And what you get with that is more power efficiency and speed. So smaller processes are better, is the shorthand here. And their new process is coming online, and Apple basically has bought the output of it. And that's what we think the M3 is going to be. So you would expect it to be more power efficient and faster. I also wonder, Apple has based, the M1 was based on the A13 in the iPhone. The M2 was based on the what was it? 14 and 15. M1 was A14, M2 is A15. A16 is in the current iPhone 14 Pro. A lot of numbers here. Sorry about that. Apple's got very confusing numbers. I wonder, my point here is, I think there's a real good possibility that what we see with the M3 is not the chip that's in the iPhone 14 Pro expanded upon, but instead is actually some stuff that we haven't seen on the iPhone yet, that Apple may actually flip the sequence here a little bit and move to a next generation set of processor cores or graphics cores or other things on the Mac before we see them on the iPhone. This is a great mystery of Apple Silicon, but at some point it's not unreasonable to think, even though the iPhone is the most important thing, that the Mac needs more of everything than the iPhone does in terms of chips. So maybe they would start there, and then the slimmed down version would be in the iPhone. We will see. I think that the reports are that this summer we will probably see the M3 for the first time. So, and we'll see if they if they release an M3 this summer, it will mean that they're on an annual cycle. At least it will have been a year since the M2. The M1 to the M2 was more like 18 months, but there were factory shutdowns and COVID and lots of things going on there that might be obscuring what Apple's actual goal is, which is to get a new chip every year, I think, for the Mac. Yes.
Jason, do you ever think that Apple will get back to allowing you to upgrade RAM after the computer is purchased?
I It generally, I would say no. And the reason is the architecture that they built for the iPhone that is part of Apple Silicon. So what happens is it's not in the chip, but it's in the package. So basically, the
Mhm.
RAM chip and the Apple Silicon, the M1 or the M2, are all together. They live together in a package on the motherboard. So they're all kind of connected together in one blob. Um, and the advantage of that is they're so close together. And remember, the chip has CPU, so processing cores, and GPU, graphics cores, along with things like the neural engine, which does machine learning based calculations, all of that stuff, and other stuff too. And they're all
Mhm.
together and very close together, and they share that memory, which is a unique feature, or it is not what traditional computers do. Traditional computers have memory for the CPU, and memory for the GPU is separate. So they get a lot of benefits from that. It's worked really well for them. And
Mhm.
I think they think that most people don't actually need um, to upgrade RAM later. The problem is that, I mean, it also, I mean, it makes them more money, right? Because you have to choose. And so you're going to, if you can, you choose higher because you know you can never change it later. The only caveat I have is that if they build this Mac Pro and they come up with some way of having a system where there's sort of like the super fast memory that's on the chip, but you can also add like a bank of memory behind it that is not as fast, and they have a system to sort of like use it, but sort of cache everything in the fast memory and all that. Never say never, right? They could do something like that, and if it was successful, I could see them maybe bringing it to some Macs. But even then, I think it would only be the most expensive. It might be a MacBook Pro or a Mac Studio and the Mac Pro.
Mhm.
It might
Mhm.
only ever be the Mac Pro. So I wouldn't bet on it, especially for the computers that most people buy, like a MacBook Air. I think it's unlikely.
All right. All right. Thank you.
Mhm. Any other questions while we're stopped?
Uh, we have a question about another topic. So no,
Okay, we'll
I would
say those for
say
the end.
right. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. And we'll sweep everything up at the end too.
All right.
Um all right, laptops. Like I said, this is somewhere between 3/4 or or 4/5 of Apple's lineup in terms of sales. Um One of the most exciting things, so one of the things that I think is really great about the last couple of years is that Apple has started to make Macs that are different. Like it felt like the Mac, and maybe this was a function of them waiting for Apple Silicon, but it felt like the Mac was kind of unchanged for a long time in terms of what Macs you could buy. They had a fairly simple, repeatable lineup, and they would update it regularly. And with the Mac Studio, we got a computer that was like different. It was not the Mac Mini. It was not a Mac Pro. That was exciting. Well, there's another, and then before that was like the 12-inch MacBook. Well, there's another laptop that's rumored to be coming. Sounds like this is pretty solid reporting from people, including Mark Gurman at Bloomberg, who's got very good sources. Okay. You can't. They know what they're making because of the supply chain assembling it out of parts, but you don't always know what they're going to call it because that's marketing and that's a decision that's made in Cupertino. So what is this thing? Is it a MacBook Air? Some people are saying it's a MacBook Air. I don't know whether it'll be called that or not. But the idea is, imagine the current 13-inch M2 MacBook Air design and then pull it out so that it's a 15-inch screen. A lot of people would really love that. Right now, if you want a big screen Apple laptop, you have to get the 16-inch MacBook Pro, which starts at, I think, $2,500. It's a huge leap from the 13-inch Air to get just a bigger screen. And so it sounds like Apple is going to fulfill that part of the market that has not been fulfilled with a 15-inch, call it MacBook Air. Maybe they won't call it that. I don't know. But a 15-inch laptop that will otherwise be, I think, spec for spec, other than the battery, because they can make the battery a little bit bigger. The same as the M2 MacBook Air. There's a question about whether it will have an M2 chip in it or whether they will wait and it'll have the M3 chip and come out this summer. That is a bit of a mystery. There are conflicting reports about that. But I have an M2 MacBook Air. I assume some of you do too. I love it. It is one of the best computers that Apple has ever made. It's just spectacularly good. I think it's plenty of enough power for most people. And if they make a 15-inch version of that, I think it's going to be a hit actually, because I think a lot of people want a bigger, just a bigger screen, right? And they don't want to spend. I think people are often prompted like, well, I'll get the MacBook Air. It's like, oh, well, they have make a bigger screen laptop. How much is that? And they're like, well, it's like $1,000 more. I'm like, well, forget it. I'm not going to get it then.
We have a couple of questions, but I want to comment. I just purchased a MacBook Pro with a 16-inch screen, and I do have a MacBook Air, the smaller ones, and I cannot express how much better in working with the computer is this 16-inch.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, it is expensive, and I maxed out the memory, but it's my work computer. But the difference is just phenomenal with between this one and the MacBook Air.
Yeah. Yeah, and there are a lot of differences, right? There's the screen size, which I think is actually a huge part of it, but also that screen. If you've not seen the MacBook 14 or 16-inch MacBook Pro screen, it is spectacular. It's the best screen that Apple has made for a Mac, and they're fast and they're great. The challenge is that if all you want is a bigger screen right now, you do have to pay more than $1,000 to get it. It's a great screen. Like I have nothing against those computers at all. They're great. It's just I think that there may be a soft part of the market there that Apple has recognized where some people want the bigger screen and would be willing to pay a little more for it, but not more than $1,000 more for it. And that's what this 15-inch laptop would probably be.
We do have a question. Fred Pryor, can you unmute yourself and ask your question? Fred, are you there? Fred's question is about internal storage. What about upping the internal storage of these computers? Because even the basic one comes with, to me, not enough to even turn it on. So
this is a classic Apple problem, right? This is a classic because it's not new. It's not even Apple Silicon related. Like Apple has been limiting storage options, and they've made them more difficult to now. It's kind of impossible to replace after the fact. But they've always had this thing where they start you way too low, and all the upgrades cost an enormous amount to get more storage. So I can't say I think that's going to change. I think it's one of the ways that Apple makes their money. I agree. It's frustrating. Apple should the base level of storage should go up faster than it does, right? Like they always seem like they're 2 steps behind in terms of the base. And you know why they do it, right? They do it so that you can say that the MacBook Air is not like the M1 is $999 or the M2 is $1199, I think. And then you look at it and you go, well, yeah, but I'm not buying it with the base storage. And suddenly, so you get them in the door with the low price, and then you look at it and say, well, yeah, but I can't buy it at the low price. I need to buy the next step up. And now you've spent several $100s more when you're all said and done. So, Apple's got its reasons, technically for doing it the way they do it. But so all I can say is I agree that it's a problem, and I think that Apple doesn't see it as a problem because they see it as a moneymaker. So I think that the challenge, like, do I think Apple will change its behavior in this regard? I don't. I haven't seen any evidence of that for like more than a decade, that they will under configure the base models and make you upgrade when you buy it and spend extra money, and then after the fact. I mean, the good news about storage in general is that external storage is actually really fast and pretty cheap these days, but external storage is not the same as internal storage in terms of speed and in terms of convenience, especially if you're using a laptop, unfortunately. Desktop, it's less of an issue. SSD, you can like tape an SSD to the back of your display and have fast extra storage, but on a laptop, it's a lot harder. I just don't, so yes, I agree, and I just don't see it because even before Apple Silicon made it, and Apple's new approaches with SSDs made it harder, made it impossible basically to upgrade. Even when it was possible, it was hard, and Apple still was playing those games in terms of configuration. So I don't think it'll change.
All right. Fred Hawthorne, can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes. When do you think we're going to have a new 27-inch iMac?
This is from later in my thing. I'll bring it up now. I have bad news. As somebody who I've got a 27-inch iMac right over there. In fact, as somebody who has used the 27-inch iMac up until last year for my entire time out on my own, I love the 27-inch iMac. Apple, as far as I can tell, and I actually have talked to some people on the inside about this behind the scenes. I think Apple has decided that they don't want to make it. I don't know if they'll change their mind, but I think the decision to make the studio display, the 27-inch studio display, and the rumors are there's another one coming that is going to be the kind of the fancier screen tech, and it's going to be more expensive, but bright and beautiful. Whereas the studio display that I have right in front of me now is literally the same panel as the last generation 27-inch iMac, right? It's the same. I think they decided that when they built the studio display, that's what they were embracing. Is like, look, if you want a bigger display, we're not going to make a second iMac. We're going to make this big display, and we're going to give you an array of things to attach to it, which could be a Mac Mini, or it could be a Mac Studio, or eventually it could be a Mac Pro, and it could also be a laptop. And then you dock it, you plug it in, and then you're using that 27-inch display. So there are no credible reports that Apple is even working on a 27-inch iMac. So I would say, if you love the iMac at this point, you need to decide whether you're going to get the 24-inch model and use that. And like I said, M1 is long in the tooth. M3 hopefully is coming this fall. If that's not enough and you want a 27-inch display, I think, and you need to make a purchase now, I think the answer is that you should buy you should buy an external display, whether it's the studio display or there are some interesting third-party displays that were announced at CES that are sort of in line with the studio display specs that might be interesting. LG still makes a mediocre display that's at the right size at 27 inches, uses the same panel. I think that's the answer right now. So that's the bad news. The good news is, if you get a 27-inch external display, you can attach all sorts of things to it. Like I said, whether it's a Mac Studio or a Mac Mini or a MacBook Air or a MacBook Pro. But I don't think the 27-inch iMac is happening. I think it's too bad, because I think that giving iMac buyers two options there's nothing wrong with that. But Apple is making this decision, and Apple knows what the sales figures are. And they must have decided that really because they know how much it's going to cost them to stock different iMacs and to engineer different iMacs and do different iMac updates. And they may have just made the decision that they're better off with a display solution at 27 and then an iMac at 24. That seems to be where they are. Bad news. Sorry.
All right. Jim Cutler, can you please unmute yourself and ask a question?
Okay. You're talking about how wonderful external storage is. Yet there's a software group that is changing things in the operating system and applications, storing media files in the user library folder. And that means that if you like to have online and usable a large number of media files, audiobooks in particular, but there's lots of others as well, it gets a little difficult. So I have to go for the very large internal storage, or for the desktop, live with the whole home folder on an external drive. So
you have apps that won't let you move the media somewhere other than the home folder?
Well, books for one, that's been that way since
Apple Books.
Yeah, since they destroyed iTunes, it's been that way. And then there are external apps like Dropbox, who currently is trying to force users to put all their files in a user library.
Right. Well, that is true. Although I'm gonna correct one thing you said there about Dropbox forcing them. Apple's forcing Dropbox to do it. That's the truth of it. So I would say point your ire toward Apple, because Apple has come to all those cloud storage providers and said, you need to use the same system we use for iCloud. Your system that you were using is going to go away in a future Mac OS update. We're going to shut it off, and you need to get off of it and onto our cloud storage API. And you're right. The cloud storage API puts everything in your home folder. The external storage is good. It's not a panacea. You're absolutely right. I'm a little surprised that somebody hasn't come up with a hack that lets you do like a hard link to an external drive for books. But even then, right, if your drive is not available, things get broken real fast. So it's not a panacea. I ended up doing so on my previous iMac. I literally had an SSD taped to the back of my computer, and I would offload everything I could to it. But you're right. At some point, if you've got a lot of media and you want it to be online, I would come back to the same answer, which is this is how Apple gets you. This is and it's not just they get you with your money, but they also get you with your fear that you're going to run out of storage, so you spend more money in order to have more storage internally, even though you might not use it, because what if, right? And that is, I'm sure Apple knows, a powerful motivator to get people to buy more storage, and that's pure profit for them, right? Like if you look at what those chips cost and what Apple charges, it's pure
That's
profit.
the economic driver that puts the entire home folder on an external drive.
Yeah, it's a bad user experience, but look, offering 5 megabytes, 5 gigabytes, I guess, 5 gigabytes of free cloud storage for everybody when you can't do anything with that anymore, and they haven't updated that in more than a decade, that's a bad user experience too. I would argue that Apple should have changed that, I don't know, 8 years ago, and they haven't changed their default free iCloud storage either, because they want to upsell you to more storage for 99 cents a month, which just seems like such a waste of effort to get people to do that. But the truth is, Apple's always kept an eye on its profit margins, and it's always been uncomfortable when the people who want to make more money defeat the people who want a good user experience. And I'm not saying that, Apple should have the greatest user experience and lose money, right? They're a profit-making corporation. They need to do that. But sometimes it feels like it gets out of balance. And you can point to a lot of the places where it's out of balance. And the iCloud free storage is one. And I would say the base model and the cost of all of the storage configurations and the RAM configurations, for that matter, is part of it too. So cloud storage, I hope that there are some OS changes there that might allow you to do cloud storage on an external, but it's not. Yeah, you're right. It's not great. There's a lot of stuff that Apple has done in recent years that just assume you're going to load it all in your home folder. It's true.
Okay. All right. We're going to hold questions and let you continue, Jason.
All right. So the next big thing in Apple's calendar is probably the developer conference, which has not been announced yet, but they do it every June. In the first full week of June, I imagine they'll do it again. I have a bunch of friends. I live in the Bay Area, so it doesn't matter to me, but I have a bunch of friends. Almost everybody I work with as a colleague is coming from somewhere else. They're not local, and they're frustrated because they want to make their plans. And I keep telling them, their airline reservations, their hotel reservations. I keep telling them, it's always the last week of school in the Bay Area. Developer conferences going on when my kids are graduating or things like that. My kids are now out of school in the Bay Area, but still, I would put money on it.
Photoshop, especially beginners.
Sorry, Bob. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, go ahead, Jason.
So I would imagine it'll happen the first week in June, like it always does. I imagine that the developer conference will feel very much like it did last year, where Apple will do an event at Apple Park. They will invite some developers. They will invite the press. They will put on a show. The truth is that even when they had a few thousand people in San Jose or San Francisco, almost everybody who was an Apple developer couldn't attend, because you could never make an event large enough that everybody could attend. Even if they could afford to attend, even if it was free, even if Apple paid for their flights, there's no venue that would, the market has just become too huge. The developer community is too huge. So I think for most people, it will be actually better than it was before, because Apple has continued to embrace since 2020 this idea of a remote friendly developer conference where they do sessions, but they stream them all and they release them on video, and it's great. What they do other than the developer stuff, what they do is they do also on Monday, it's like a media day, essentially. It's an opportunity for them to make some big announcements that are relevant to developers, but also like the iPhone event that they have every year. It is an opportunity for them to make big announcements to the press and assemble the press in Cupertino to listen to what they have to say. So I imagine that will happen again. This year is going to be different, though, I feel. There are not a lot of reports out there about the next versions of iOS, iPadOS, macOS, tvOS, watchOS. I assume there will be updates to all of those. I assume that they will add some new features and make some new changes, and that it'll all sync across all of those devices, and you know what they do. But it really feels like unless they change their mind, and I don't think they are going to. I have it on pretty good authority that the hardware for their next big product is done and the software is wrapping up. So it seems like they're going to launch a new product in a new product category, and that June is going to be when it happens. At this point, that seems like by far the most likely scenario. And this is that VR headset thing that Apple Reality Pro is probably what it's going to be called. It's probably going to be Reality OS. And if you there's actually an excellent video if you don't know what this product is. I recommend you search for Snazzy Labs on YouTube. Quinn, who is the Snazzy Labs guy, it's his YouTube channel, Quinn Nelson. His latest video that he put out yesterday is basically rolling up every single leak and rumor about the Apple VR headset and what it means. And he is a very smart guy who has tried every VR headset ever and has opinions and has expertise. I will give you the shorthand here because a lot of you are probably like, oh, brother, really? This is what they're doing? It's going to be really expensive, probably like in the $3,000 range. They're probably not, as a result, they're not going to sell very many of them. Reports are they expect less than 1 million in sales. I'd say that it's basically a developer kit plus for people who are curious. I am of the belief that you do have to start somewhere. You do have to ship a product at some point. I'm not going to say real artists ship like Steve Jobs, but I think there is truth in the fact that if you as a company spend 5 years preparing for a product and then you ship it and then spend 5 years iterating on that product, at the end of 10 years, you will be in a much, much stronger place than if you spent 10 years behind the scenes preparing for a product. Because I think there's nothing like a first generation product to teach you a lot of lessons about what works and what doesn't work and what people hate and what people like. You kind of got to ship it and see what happens. The risk for Apple is that they ship it and nobody wants it and everybody thinks it's dumb and everybody thinks the whole category is dumb and that and then forget it. We're just, it's a loser, haha, Apple, and we're done. But Apple's got a lot of money in the bank, and Apple seems really committed to VR. And then in the long run, augmented reality, right? In the long run, I think Apple's end goal is glasses that people can wear that will have information on them that they can control with gestures and do all those things, but they'll be light and non-intrusive, and it will be potentially a replacement for your computer and your smartphone and like everything else. I think that they believe that that's possible. And this is another point I want to make when I talk about this stuff. Why would Apple do this? I think number one reason Apple is in on this is that they foresee a possibility that will go from VR to those AR glasses I just described that people can wear out in the world. They are very high tech. They're displaying things that they can see. They can listen to what you're saying. They know what you're seeing. You can control them with hand gestures or just movements of your eye, all of these kind of science fictional things. They are right now science fictional things, but you could extrapolate and say that in the 2030s, we might get there. And the reason, if you're Apple, you care about what people might use in the mid to late 2030s is because if you're Apple and you've got $60 billion in cash, in net cash, just sitting in the bank somewhere, or in a mattress. I don't know where they keep their $50 billion in cash. What are you worried about? This is I'm talking about a VR headset, and yet I'm going to get really kind of like big picture here for a second. Like, why is Apple going down this path? Apple's going down this path because if you're Apple and the number one thing that you are is the iPhone and it's more than half of your business, I really believe the only existential threat, okay, a severed relationship with China would be a huge existential threat for Apple because their supply chain is in China and it would be hard for them to make products. That's number one. But the number two biggest threat to Apple is actually that the smartphone is replaced by something else, right? Like, I really believe that as long as we have smartphones in our pockets, as long as there are smartphones in our pockets, there will be iPhones, and the iPhone will be profitable and successful, and Apple will make a lot of money. I think it's actually going to be really hard to kill Apple now. It's funny coming out of the 90s to say that, but I think I have a hard time imagining that the iPhone would be abandoned to degrade and become not successful. I think Apple will always be really on that. But what if the smartphone gets replaced by something else? I think if you're Apple, you're like, let's put some money into whatever we think the likely replacement is, so that if the glasses do replace the smartphone or augment it, either way, we are there. It's a very Steve Jobs thing, right? It's the be your own replacement, right? It's the iPod Nano is the classic example. It's like, get rid of the iPod Mini. It's very successful, but we've replaced it with the iPod Nano. Or let's get rid of the iPod. We've replaced it with the iPhone. So this is what they're doing. When you're the size of Apple and you have all of that cash in the bank, it's actually, I think, responsible for you as an executive to say, what are our biggest threats? Let's put money into, being our own replacement if it comes to that. So I'm not sure even people at Apple truly believe that in 2035, everybody's going to be wearing glasses with AR stuff in them, or that VR and mixed reality, which is what this headset first generation is, and its successors for quite a while, frankly, are going to be in, that will necessarily be huge. I think it's more that it's a bet of like, let's try it. And if we can't do it, maybe nobody can. But if we can do it and it's successful, then we've built our own replacement and we'll continue to be successful. I think that's really what's motivating them big picture. In the near term, what's this product going to be? Well, the one we see this year is, like I said, probably not going to be for almost anybody. Very expensive, very high end. But if you watch Quinn Nelson's video, you will get a sense of what the possibilities are here. And there are a lot of really interesting technical possibilities. If Apple has done its job, like, we don't know, maybe they have. If they have the ability to have you do hand gestures and not have controllers in your hands, like with the Oculus or the Meta Quest 2 that I have, where you have to hold game controllers. If you can literally just do everything like this, and it's reading your body language, and it's reading where your eyes are looking, and it's doing all of that, it could be a real leap forward that could propel this category, so that when they make the more affordable version in a year or two, that people actually want it. But I do think that they're looking at the big picture. And if you don't care about VR, I would suggest hiding for a little while, because I suspect this summer that's what we're going to be talking about.
Question, Jason.
Yes. And that's basically the end of my outline. So I'm wide open to any questions anybody has about anything.
All right, cool. I believe I recently read that Google Glasses have stopped development. So if they have, why would Apple then want to pick this up?
Well, the Google Glass is a very different kind of technology, right? And I think this is part of the challenge, is that Google went to market too soon with a product that was really not that capable. Because the Google Glass is first off, is that, if you believe my framing, which is that we're probably not going to get glasses with real proper AR and all the bells and whistles at the level that people will want it for 10 years at least. Google Glass was trying to be that. And so it was really trying to push way ahead into that augmented reality category. And Apple is doing what Meta is doing, which is making enclosed ski goggle like things that do VR. And when they say mixed reality, if you don't know these, and sometimes they call it XR, which is dumb, or MR, mixed reality. So VR headset cuts you off from the world, right? It's replacing your view of the world with a view. The Apple headset is rumored to have essentially two 4K 4K displays, one for each eye. So super high resolution. Really going to be interesting to see how they do. But that's VR. It's showing you what's on its display. When we talk about mixed reality, what we're talking about is there are like cameras on the outside of the thing. And there's a mode where the cameras pass through and you see on those screens on the inside what's on the outside. So it's like you're wearing a headset, but you're seeing what your eyes would be seeing. The difference is you're seeing it on a screen and stuff can get overlaid on it. The dream is that down the road, you would wear something that would actually, your eyes would see what's in front of you, but also things could be overlaid. But that is a lot harder to do, especially in tech that doesn't look like you're wearing a helmet. So, so I would say Google's explorations are interesting, but they're kind of like not the product that Apple is trying to make. And I think Apple foresees a path where you start with VR, and then you. What happens with computer stuff, right? You start with VR, and then the chips get faster, and the sensors get cheaper and smaller, and the power consumption drops, and everything gets miniaturized. And if you keep pushing on that, a decade out, you've got something you can wear that's as light as a pair of glasses ish. But that's not what you could do today. There are products out there like Google Glass today, but none of them I would say are any good, or certainly up to the standards of sort of what Apple thinks this product category will be like.
Okay. Hank Humphrey, does that answer your question? Hank, unmute yourself.
Thank you, Jason. Obviously, you're in California. We're out here in the weeds, and we're more having problems with the software and the user experience than the hardware.
Yeah.
That we are every day, and those of us who are on this program are probably all the tech center for our friends.
Yep.
And our friends, the level of expertise out here is so much lower than your level, the
Absolutely.
level of people you interface with. What are they doing to help us at all?
I think the flip side of saying Apple's hardware is going great is that it just exposes that the software isn't. I don't know. So what I said earlier about Apple famously not hiring a lot and Apple not having big teams, you see that on the hardware in the sense that they are limited with what hardware they can design and how often they can refresh their hardware.
Yes.
On the software side, I think is where you really see it, because on the software side, you see software get abandoned where, it's not like literally up on blocks in the front yard, but it kind of is, where like they'll do a refresh and then they just walk away.
Yes.
And this has been one of the most frustrating things for me covering Apple in the last decade or so, is that sometimes they'll make changes that are like, oh, well, this is a good start. If you keep down this path, you're going to fix all the problems with the software. And yet it seems like from their side of it, no, that was it. We're done. See you in 5 years. And it's incredibly frustrating. So I think you've identified one of the big problems with Apple today is their hardware is great and their software process is kind of broken, and they don't have enough people to address everything. And they have gotten into this culture of moving people around to different projects, which means projects get abandoned because people are moving to something else. And it also means that there are not owners for particular parts of the system, or systems in this case. Now, Apple's trying to do something that nobody else in the world is doing, right? Apple is building a core operating system and a core set of apps, and then deploying them across desktops and laptops and phones and tablets and watches and TVs and pretty soon VR goggles, right? Yeah. High degree of difficulty. So credit them for that. But if you're a Mac user at the end of the day and you're like, why is this app not working right? Right? Or why is this part of the system not working right?
Yes.
And what's most disturbing, so I write a book about photos that I update every year. There's a photos team. People are working on photos every year. But there are other parts of the system and other apps, like the system settings app that got added to Ventura this last fall, System Preferences was a bad app. It was largely not fixed since OS 10, 10.0 started it, right? Like it's really didn't change very much. So they're like, we're going to redo it. Well, the new one's terrible in different ways, but it's still terrible. It's horribly disorganized. And I have been told by people who work on it that they're still working on it, which is great. But like my gut feeling after 10 years of watching a lot of this stuff is you're all going to get pulled off this project that's not finished and put on some other thing. And then you'll work there for a year and then it won't be finished. And then you'll be pulled off on some other thing. So I don't have an answer here other than to say that Apple has chosen a very high degree of difficulty. Their corporate culture has shown that they've actually gotten really good at building hardware and doing chip design. And that for whatever reason, their software, whether it's because they're understaffed, which I think is part of it, or because they're culturally, they just can't keep focus and iterate on all of the things they're doing. They feel like they have to jump around. They have too many different projects going on. For whatever reason, it's kind of broken. And this just between us, just our little small group, I have a bunch of friends who are developers, and although they're very angry about things like the App Store and Apple's lack of documentation and all those kind of things, they also seem to really love like Apple's head of software, Craig Federighi, who seems like a genuinely nice guy, and he's one of them. He's a computer nerd. He's a developer background. Like he's one of them. They're very simpatico with him, and he's great at presenting. He's gotten a lot better. We've kind of seen him grow up on stage in a lot of ways. But I got to say it, I don't care how nice a guy he is. If he's responsible for the software at Apple, something is wrong. He's not doing his job, or somebody's preventing him from doing his job. That's also possible. But like, so this is not productive other than to say that I agree with you. This is an ongoing challenge with Apple, is their lack of attention to detail. And I would argue lack of ownership internally for products. It feels very much like when you get to the bottom of something that's broken, what you find is the person who worked on it isn't there anymore, or the person who worked on it knows all about it, but has been retasked with something else, right? Maybe they're working on something for the headset now. And so it sits there. And the solution to that, in part, what would have been retroactively for Apple to not be quite as ambitious in a bunch of areas. That's the other part of this that's a problem, is Apple sometimes will come in with this grand ambition of like, we're going to do books, right? Or why does Apple Books exist? The truth is it kind of exists out of spite because they want to take money away from Amazon. But they're committing to a whole book infrastructure that people have to update and support. And then they came out with their iBooks Author app, which was supposed to be good, and a bunch of publishers sort of standardized on it, but it never got updated, and then it got abandoned after a few years of radio silence. Like, this story kind of keeps coming back and back. So I hear you. I don't have any good answers. I think that I think the TLDR version, the too long didn't read version, would be this, which is maybe it's a good thing that we haven't heard lots of rumors about all those operating systems and it's all about the headset for WWDC, because maybe that means the people working on all the other operating systems will get a year where the pressure's off and they can just fix bugs. That would be good. I would love to see that.
Don't count on that. I have two topics I want you to touch on that are really hot here. One is hearing devices, and another is the car. Can you touch on those quickly?
Right. Yeah, and I saw a couple things going through the chat, including will Apple make a hearing aid, and what about people with vision issues? Couple of things. If you've got severe vision issues, the headset's probably not going to be for you. However, there's other tech that's coming that I think is very interesting, and AirPods is a great example of that. AirPods. So there's been some deregulation in terms of hearing aids. AirPods already are kind of an augmented reality product, and they have a lot of intelligent tech in them. I would not be surprised if Apple keeps pushing the AirPods line forward in terms of it being doing more, first off, to augment and improve sound like a hearing aid. Now that Apple, like I said, now that the rules for what defines a hearing aid and how you can sell a hearing aid have changed, favorably for companies like Apple. I think that they're going to keep going down that path of like, what can we do if you stick something in the ears that's a computer that's attached to a phone probably and has its own microphones and all those things? Well, that's augmented reality for your ears instead of your eyes, right? There's some very interesting things that could happen there in terms of Apple innovating and potentially outdoing or augmenting what companies that make other hearing aids and other devices like that do, especially when you blend in the software. And that's the other point I wanted to make is there's some technology out there now for people who have vision issues where if you've got a phone with a camera, there used to be or there's an app. What is it? Is it See It For Me? Be My Eyes? I forget what it's called, but it's an app that used to be if you have vision issues, you could basically bring up this app and a person would look at your camera output and tell you what was there so that you could get it. But this technology is advancing so rapidly now that machine learning stuff, AI stuff is going to be able to do that for you. And some of it already is happening with Apple in latest versions of iOS, where it will say, there's a door to the left, it's got this label on it. That technology is going to keep advancing. And I do think that there's a point where, especially if you're talking about people with vision issues, where you should be able to put a pair of AirPods in and they, ideally, eventually, they will be able to see and describe your world around you, and you can talk to them and ask them questions, and they will be able to guide you. Because augmented reality isn't just about the eyes, right? It is about your ears too, and other senses too. And I think that Apple's actually way ahead with the AirPods at that. But there's more that they could do. But I'm excited about that. I think that that's actually a place where Apple has shown that they're very good at what they do. And some of the stuff on the iPhone for accessibility, where they're able to use machine learning and the camera to figure out what's going on around you and describe it to you. That stuff's only going to get better and better, and that's going to be really great too. The car was the other thing that got mentioned. Shortest version of the car is I believe that the same motivation for the VR stuff is the motivation for the car, which is there an opportunity here? I think some point in the mid 2010s, Apple said, all cars are going to go electric and they're all going to be driven by a very complicated software stack that does self-driving and stuff like that. And we're good at lots of that stuff. Somebody there made the argument, tech companies are going to basically take over the car industry in the next 15 years. Do we want to be one of them? And they're like, we got $60 billion in cash in the bank. Or at that point, it was probably like 120 billion, honestly. They had a lot of cash back then. They've tried to put that into stock repurchases and stuff in the meantime and dividends. Let's do it. The difference is that this VR product has come to be a product now, and the car seems to still not be a product. And I think the question to ask is, at what point after you make that bet, that I think is probably a perfectly fine bet to make, do you say, oh, we were wrong, right? It's not going to be, or, oh, we missed our spot. With Apple, I would say it feels to me like they missed their spot, and that all of the car companies have kind of figured it out now and are moving, and that their advantage that they would have had 5 or 7 or 8 years ago is gone. And that I would be surprised now if we ever see an Apple car. Not that it couldn't happen, but it feels like the moment has passed. And that I think it might be more likely that they'll see some strategic partnerships with automakers rather than Apple making a car for itself. But never say never. I mean, it's possible.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, they could have bought Tesla. They could buy Lucid. Like, I feel like if they really wanted to sell a car in the next few years, they should just buy a car maker. And there are available between Tesla and Rivian and especially Lucid. There are electric car makers out there that are actually a pretty good fit for Apple if they wanted to do that. So it feels to me like maybe it was an interesting idea for the moment, and the moment has passed.
Question: from Don Winfrey, how dependent is Apple on producing in China, and where else can they go and why?
They are at the moment very dependent. And that China relationship has really helped Apple, and it's helped China. And Tim Cook has turned, he's a bit of a diplomat now, basically. And Apple definitely, if there was a sudden severing of the relationship between the US and China, Apple would be in big trouble. And I think that there was a period where they didn't believe it. And then there was a period where they left the period of denial, and then they came into a period of realization, but felt stuck. And they now seem to be. COVID actually, I think, has been a good cover for them to talk about not leaving China, but to talk about it in terms of not having all their eggs in one basket. Because the challenge is, if they say, well, we're leaving China, is that China, where all of their stuff is, will make life very difficult for them. They can't do that. It would be embarrassing for China. It would be, they would lash out at Apple. It would be bad.
Well,
But-
I thought that they also have some dealings now in India where they're going to try to have some of their, go ahead.
Yeah. So here's what happened is that COVID, there ended up being factory shutdowns, and it turned out like all the Macs were made in a very small part of China. And all of this kind of part for the iPhone were made in this this is the factory that makes the iPhone Pro, and it's shut down. It's like, okay, well, that's not good. So now Apple is in a new path where they're saying, all right, they've been tinkering, but now they're like, okay, we need to spread out. And some of that's going to be spread out in China, but some of it's going to be spread out to other places. The challenge is that they're exploring in India, they're exploring in Vietnam, they're exploring in Brazil a little bit, although some of that was based on tariffs and things like that. So they've been able to use, I think the key with China is they need to have an excuse that isn't, we need to diversify out of China, when what they're doing is diversifying out of China. And I think that if they do it artfully, they're going to be able to do it. But I think it's going to take a decade at least, and it's still going to be difficult for them to do. But I think they want to get to a point where they're not, they could survive a rift in US-China relations. And they're, by the way, I'll also say their chips are made in Taiwan. Right. So that's a danger of a different sort, which is if China decided to invade Taiwan, TSMC factories in Taiwan might go offline. That's one reason why the U.S. is helping pay for example, TSMC to build a fab in Arizona. Right. Like this is all, it's geopolitics. It's hedging your bets. Anyway, the big story the last few weeks has been that in China, Apple can go to China and basically to the Communist Party and be like, say, we need this in China. And they're like, okay, we'll make it happen. And in India, which is a democracy, and more than that, a federal democracy where the rules are different in every state, all the labor laws are different. Apple is going through the process now of slowly working with each individual state government in India to get the labor laws. They want to change labor laws, not necessarily to be super evil, but to do things like have the ability to work 12-hour shifts instead of 8-hour shifts, so you work 3 long days instead of 4 short days or something like that, right? That's currently some states in India that's illegal, or the flexibility to work overtime in some places is illegal. And they're like, look, we need this for our factories. And that's fine. But what it shows is that they're actively working with the same partners they use in China, in India. And I know I've heard it in Vietnam, definitely. They're trying, right? But it's hard. It's going to take a lot of time because everything is happening in a fairly small region in China where it's not that all the parts are made there, right? Like Apple is very proud of the fact that actually a lot of the parts from Macs and iPhones are made in the US and in other places around the world. But so many of the little parts are in China, and that's where all the assembly is. And it's going to be hard to change that. So they're on the path now, I think, of diversifying, but they're nowhere close to being diversified.
All right. Jason, I want to thank you for such an amazing, interesting session with us. And who knows, maybe one day you and I can talk about those classes again. Okay.
That's right. Can we make them slightly later in the day? But yeah, no, it's great. I love talking to user groups. I hope I answered some questions and told you some stuff. And if everything I said about the VR thing is wrong, well, that'll be interesting too, right? It's going to be interesting, good or bad, I don't know, but it'll be interesting. It's going to be an interesting ride for this year. And yes, if you want to read my things or listen to my stuff, 6colors.com is the place to go.
All right. I put some links in the chat for people if they want to check out his podcast and things like that. And he has a membership site. So,
Yeah,
you know, you might
there's
be
free
interested
stuff,
in
and
that as well.
there's free stuff and member stuff, and there's podcasts
All right.
and all
Yep.
this stuff.
Thank you. Can I get everyone to please unmute yourself and give Jason a big thank you?
Thank you.
Thank
Awesome.
you.
Excellent
Thank
job.
you, Jason. Excellent job.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Jason.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
I did